Greetings and salutations, coasters. It's Malzilla again for another Malzilla minisode, megasode, Malzillasode. Still workshopping the name. Let me know in the comments what you think. I'm kind of going with Malzillasode. So, yeah. I'm recording this on July 4th, which for Americans, it's a holiday. So, yeah. Won't talk much more about that. And for the rest of the world, happy, 4th day of July. Wanted to get this Megasode, Malzillasode out a week ago, but new job, training, been busy with stuff. So, this is titled Takoyaki, anyone? We're going to be looking a little bit into IDW 79 and kind of the ramifications of that issue and kind of how it affects the franchise and kind of the idea of saying goodbye to a character. Because, spoiler, Mimic's dead. He's Takoyaki. So, let's dive in. But before we dive in, again, please do remember to like, subscribe, join us on our Discord, follow us on social media, X, Twitter, Tumblr, Blue Sky, and come talk with us. Come join with us on the Discord. We need some new blood. It's getting a little boring around the time. But now let's dive into the fun stuff. So let's dive into 79. So 79, this is not going to be a super in-depth review, but just kind of a basic what happened is that, so when we last left Tangle, Whisper, and Silver, they had kind of, in the breaking of the Diamond Cutters, restoration, whatever, Whisper decided she's going to put an end to Mimic. She's going to put an end to him once and for all. Silver's going to help. Tangle's there to kind of make sure Whisper doesn't kill anyone. Even though she plans to end Mimic. But, obviously, set up some drama. Issue 78 ended with Whisper just kind of chilling out one of the new locations that they came up with this comic. Basically, I think it's called Colorful Canyon. Basically a super colorful wannabe Grand Canyon. And, she's out there at a cafe having a good time. Or just kind of chilling with Fro with a drink. While Mimic kind of sees her in the distance, says, "Oh, she's all alone. She's gotten sloppy. Time to put an end to this." Not realizing he's walking into the biggest trap known to man. Of course, I'll get into that. But yes, so Mimic shifts into form. In this one, he takes the form of Cream, who kind of walks up to Whisper. Now, Whisper obviously knows who this is. She knows it's Mimic. She tries to bait him into saying, "Oh, how's your mom Tapioca doing?" It's like, "Oh, silly. Mummy's name is Vanilla, not Tapioca." And Whisper says, good, hey, you got her name right, but Cream doesn't call her Mummy. And, Whisper kind of rolls her eyes as Mimic shifts back into form and starts monologuing. And, she's just sipping her drink saying it's time to end this. And lo and behold, right as, Mimic goes for the knife, Silver kind of holds him up. And with his telekinesis, Whisper is all chill. Mimic realizes he's walked into arguably the most obvious trap known to man. Whisper baited him and hooked him hook, line, and sinker. So he tries to escape with a flight orb power core thing. I think that was from the Bad Guys miniseries. But, Tangle and company, they managed to get a hold of him. He does assume the form of Barry the Kawuka for a little bit. I think I pronounced the animal's name right. Oh well. But anywho, they get into one last tumble, and Whisper goes in for the coup de grace, but before she can, take the shot, I think Mimic tries to blow the two of them up by destroying the core, but Tango comes in with the Wisp on and saves both her and Whisper, while Mimic gets a case of the explosions and falls down into the ravine, splashes into water. There's a little... I mean, it's basically the water forms a skull and crossbones, indicating that, yeah, he's gone. Now, Tangle asked Whisper because, she lost her mask. She's this is a big moment for her, but Whisper is crying, but these are tears of joy, saying it's finally over. She embraces her wisps and basically tells her former team, Slinger, Claire, and Smithy, that they've basically avenged. It's over, and it's, time to move on. Fortunately, Silver asks, what's next for the guardian angel of the battlefield when there's no battlefield left? She admits to not thinking that far ahead, and Tangle says they should go home, which Whisper agrees, and the trio heads off. So, I guess Tangle and Whisper are finally now roommates. And the fans rejoiced. They were roommates. Really? Roommates? I'm just joking. I like Whispangle. It's fun. It'll be interesting to see what they do with Whisper next, because in ways this is kind of a conclusion of her character arc. So she's got revenge. Mimic is dead, quotation marks, air quotes. But the issue ends with Sonic and the Chaotix walking through a forest, but that's kind of insignificant to the discussion at hand today. So the big question is Mimic actually Takoyaki now? Is Mimic actually dead? Now, this is a kid's comic, and, there's all these words. If there's no body, there's no death. We do see him kind of, what looks to be his charred corpse, fall into the ravine. Maybe not. We don't know. Again, this is a children's comic, so they're not going to get... Everything is going to be kind of vague. But it also kind of leads into an old comic book saying that, if you grew up in the 80s and 90s, was pretty much gospel. That, there's the saying is, no one stays dead except for Bucky Barnes, Jason Todd, and Uncle Ben. Now, this comic book unofficial rule would be basically undone by Ed Brubaker and Judd Witnick working for Marvel and DC in 2005 and 2006, when coincidentally at the same time, with no correlation, Ed brought back Bucky as the Winter Soldier and Judd brought back Jason as the Red Hood. So, 2 out of the 3 big, characters that could never come back were back with a very violent lease on life. Uncle Ben is still dead, though, except for in Ultimate Spider-Man, where it was May who died. And Uncle Ben and J. Jonah Jameson are like news BFFs. Read Ultimate Spider-Man. It's the Spider-Man book the fans deserve. MJ is Spider-Mom. Just kidding. She's mom. Peter and MJ are married. It's great. So what does this mean for Mimic? Everything and nothing at the same time, basically. It's everything and at the same time nothing. The death, again, as mentioned, is perfectly vague. This kind of leans in with what IDW is how far they're willing to go. It kind of also gives them an out to say, if we bring him back, as Mecha Mimic, or, oh no, I faked my death, blah, blah, blah. It kind of writes him. It's like with Starline. When Starline got crushed by the boulder, it was kind of one of the things where it's pretty finite, but there's enough wiggle room where if they decide to bring him back, they could. Now, this is something to be mentioned that, speaking of Starline, the only other really bad guy to bite it, it's been 3 years since he's died. He's been gone for 3 years, and I'm actually kind of surprised. I figured, he'd be back because, again, a lot of fans... I wasn't a huge Starline fan, but I know a lot of fans who were. So, yeah, I mean, it's been 3 years. He's still not back yet. I'm inclined to think if they don't bring him back for issue 100, because again, that's the big next milestone. 100 issues is a pretty damn big milestone. So, yeah, I'm almost inclined to think if Starling doesn't come back for 100, which would be probably 5 years after his death, then I think he might be DEAD dead permanently, which is kind of crazy. And so there's that. And so the same thing with Mimic is maybe Mimic will show up in a few years down the road, maybe not. And I think it does bring up some interesting discussion about when does it time for a character to take that final bow? When has their journey ended? Now with Mimic, his whole thing was that he was there to kind of be Whisper's boogeyman. He had betrayed the team. She had brought him in, as we saw in the last year's annual. And rule of thumb is once you dive deep into the villain's backstory and quote unquote how tragic it is or not, or just learn how much of a sociopath or psychopath they are. Usually, once you learn that stuff, they're usually not long for this world. So, once Gigi wrote that story in the annual, it's like, okay, let's start the clock because Mimic ain't gonna be around for much longer. Now that we kind of, the curtain has been lifted, and we see what things have been done. So, Mimic to me, his story is ended, and what would be the goal of bringing him back? What new things could you do? Would you just to torment Whisper? He was a pretty much one note in that, even though he was fun to interact, like, he and Clutch had a fun dynamic, but that ran its course. Like, everything with Mimic to me feels it ran its course. And likewise for Starline, though I do think with Starline you could do some other things, because now it's like, oh, I hate Eggman and Sonic. Obviously, Surge and Kid are still around, so there are some things you could do with Starline, even though I'm inclined to leave him as Dr. Flatline at the moment. Da-da. But again, all this does kind of go back to the idea is that Sega has a long track record of introducing characters in the games, and then after the game they're introduced, pretty much forgetting about them. Only a handful of characters have actually, dodged this fate. And, probably chief among them was Shadow, because, his character died in SA2. Like, oh no, he's not dead. And then, of course, he's become part of the big five, especially coming off. He's kind of had his own little renaissance of a character journey this last year. Last year. He had his whole year dedicated to him. But think about, like, Tikal. Like, we look at Sonic Adventure as kind of the reboot of the soft reboot of the franchise when, went from Genesis to Dreamcast. And Amy, that was kind of, Amy's reintroduction. And a lot of times we always think of Rouge as the second, major Sega female character, when in reality, Tikal debuted in Sonic Adventure. But, she kind of, you could make a good argument that her story ended, and so there was really no need to have her back, though there were some fun things with her demise being bound to the Master Emerald that you could do some fun things with her. Ian and Evan kind of used her as a reoccurring Force Ghost character to hang out with Knuckles in the post-boot Archie. So, and again, Tikal has, even in her little orb form, has kind of popped up here and there. I think she showed, if I recall correctly, she showed up a little bit in the Frontiers Knuckles, mini-sode, little anime clip. So you have that. But, yeah, a lot of time cases, introduce a new character, and then into limbo. Again, sometimes it takes some time for characters to come back. Like, for example, Nephilis. I mean, his death is, quote unquote, unraced, from time, but still there's some, wiggle room with that. And again, they brought him back in Sonic X Shadow Generations. It was arguably the best boss fight. Ridiculous amount of fanfare. Heck, this year, in the year of 2025, Sonic Channel gave him official art on Sonic's birthday. How crazy is that? It's almost a methylassance that we're in right now. But that, and then, for example, like Trip in Sonic Superstars. Obviously, that game wasn't super well received, but people liked Trip. And then it wasn't too long until she actually showed up in the comics as part of the 30th anniversary issue for Knuckles, where he kind of tried to train her in the ways of being a guardian. It was a very cute episode, cute issue, and Trip, kind of Knuckles being the big brother to Trip, and Trip kind of throwing Knuckles' perception on a few things upside down, especially if you're an old fan of the old Archie. There were some fun little, shoe drop moments. But then again, you look at Sage. Obviously, Sage was the big character of Sonic Frontiers, and luckily we're going to see her again up in Sonic Racing, Crossworlds. But again, that's a different thing. That's again, for the most part, Sega doesn't bring these characters back unless it's like, oh, it's a mobile game where we need a bunch of characters, or like Crossworlds, where half of the game's purpose is to have as many characters as you can and roll with that. Now, there are some characters where this hasn't applied to. Infinite is still MIA. He's still somewhere floating in the Phantom Ruby or some space between dimensions, even though there's been a lot of fans who've wanted him back, especially kind of in, since it's been so many years since Frontiers. People love to dunk on Infinite, but people also, there's a lot of things to like about Infinite. I think he was a good villain. He was a good villain, and Sonic's always had a villains issue outside of Eggman. But going back to the idea of the comics, it's like the fact that the comics haven't been able to use them is kind of crazy, because the comics have been in many ways been kind of the refuge for these characters. Sega has deemed their story as ended or just not relevant. Again, let's look at E123 Omega, who is part of the main cast. He's part of the Big 12 from Sonic Heroes. He barely showed up unless Shadow was around for many games. Like, he was like, of the Big 12, he showed up the least. Heck, I don't even think he and Sonic had a meaningful interaction till the Metal Virus saga. How crazy is that? And then, in the last couple of years, he's been a lot. He's shown up a lot. Again, a lot of it is Shadow connected, but still, the comics, what Ian did with him in Archie, pre-boot, post-boot, and IDW, has kind of given some of these lesser known or lesser loved characters so much value. It's kind of, the refuge of like, oh, we're done with them, but have fun, you can use them, whatever. And I think it's something obviously Ian has learned kind of through, Mimic, and kind of leading us back to Mimic and Starline, and kind of the end of their story is that if you're going to do a character, send them away, give them their final bow, you gotta let them go out on top. Well, not so much out on top. You gotta let them go with a bang. Sometimes, literally. You gotta let them have kind of final victory within their grasp. Going on a high note. Like, for example, if we go back to pre-boot Archie, I think if the reboot and the lawsuits didn't happen, I think it was pretty evident, if that timeline was still going, that the arc, once Ian finished his whole arc with, Mecha Sally, I think it's pretty evidence that Naugus was going to bite it, and bite it permanently, because he had achieved everything he wanted to do, since his first introductions. Now, obviously, his true introduction was in Sad AM, and he was obviously different, and they retooled him for the original Archie series, and then the pre-boot, he got reworked again, because he is a Sega character. As a Sad AM original, he does belong to Sega. But everything in the pre-boot Archie was that he wanted what he assumed was his, aka the Kingdom of Acorn, because of the deal he made with Max when Max was stranded in the Zone of Silence. So, after multiple chances, multiple attempts, he had finally become king. He got elected king. And there's a whole big joke of electing, the citizens electing the wrong person. We're not going to go that far, but we all know where that joke goes. Or not much of a joke anymore. Um, but yeah, it seemed like Nagus, he had everything, but everything was starting to like crack and fracture. His, you know, his relationship, his mentorship to Jeffrey St. John was fracturing. Jeffrey was starting to realize that he had messed up one of many times for that damn skunk, but it just really felt like everything was ultimately leading to his final defeat. And then once he would be defeated, I don't know what you would want to do with the character after especially that, he literally went all in and busted. He almost had it, but he didn't. And I think that's something that clearly that Ian was heading toward, but obviously couldn't do. So obviously when the reboot happened, obviously they still had access to Nagus. They retooled him into being a troll and the brother of the witch cart, where, he became Walter Nagus, the brother of Wendy Witchcart, and, Bob's your uncle, and they were able to kind of keep him going around, obviously in this new continuity, washed from the other stuff. But there were also some, dealing some stuff with, like, they're giving it some new stuff to work with. But, again, it's kind of the idea of going out on a high note. If you're a villain especially, it's having everything within your grasp, having victory all but assured, and then just absolute defeat to the point of how could you top it? But and so it really comes a case of story completion versus story hiatus, and I think for a lot of these characters, especially the villains, it feels like their story, once their story is complete, then it's done. Now, if you try to apply this to more, say, heroic characters, it gets a little difficult. It gets a little, mud flingy, because like, again, you see a lot of fans trying to get Cosmo back out of Sonic X, even though it seems like Sonic X has kind of been thrown in the vault with some of the other characters, Sonic Blitz notwithstanding. But it also feels like if you watch season 3 of Sonic X, it, even though they kind of give a bit of a, the plant rebirth type trope, but it also feels like in many ways Cosmo's story, as much as we wanted to continue, it felt like it ended with that. Whereas, but, people still want her back, and hey, we may actually be getting her back in some form. Likewise with, the Freedom Fighters, Sally, Bunny, Antoine, Rotor, Nicole, is that some might say that their story is done. I would say no. Their story got preempted by legal stuff, and, there's still room for them. That's just my opinion. But taking this back to Mimic again, as I mentioned earlier, I think he needs to stay dead. I just think, like, he had his final moments. Like, he had that, great issue by Gigi in the annual, kind of explaining his methodology, his view of the world, his psychosis, and, what would the point of bringing him back? To torment Whisper and wife? I mean, and that's one of the big criticisms I see that people have and kind of quasi get with Whisper. People have with Whisper, those who usually prefer Tangle to Whisper, is that, it's just, she's in this constant state of trauma. Now that trauma is over. If you bring it back, then it's just like, oh, what is Whisper's lot but to suffer? It's not fun. It's not a fun story to read. So, like I said, to me, I think Mimic's story is over. Could they bring him back? Sure, but I don't think he'd be any different. Like, what would be his new MO? Again, it's an open debate. When should characters come back after seemingly giving their final curtain call, and when is the current call the final curtain call? I don't know when the next little Malzillasode will be. Unless something really interesting happens in 80. I doubt I'll say anything about. I might do something about that. 81 starts a whole new arc up until kind of Evan posted on, I think, one of her social medias that, starting with 81 is kind of the slow, ramp up to 100 where things are going to get more and more intense. Um, I'm looking forward to whenever they actually decide to release the Shadow one shot that they announced in 2024 that may not come out till 2026. So, you know, see what that's all about when they finally get to that. Later this month, we will be doing Radri and I will be bringing back our good pal Chevelle. We'll go over the final, we'll relook at the Sonic DC crossover since, they just released the penultimate issue 2 weeks ago, so we've got one issue left. See, how things went. Was it good? Who was this miniseries actually written for? Was it for Sonic fans or for DC fans? We'll go over that. We are recording and editing more for our Sonic X reviews. We apologize that has taken longer than expected. But as Yoda once quoted about the Jedi texts, page turners, they were not. Sonic X is not gripping television. But we did record an episode that I'm working on editing this weekend. Hopefully, I should have that up by Monday or so. And then we'll be recording the next set with Neon's coming back as we talk about the second to last set of episodes of season 1. And as we discuss what may be the origin of Wade Whipple. So again, this is Malzillasode signing off. Again, please do follow us on socials, join the Discord, yada yada. Until next time, I'll stomp you later. Talk to you soon.